according to your anthropology knowledge, many Somalis and the nationalists, they always accuse this problem have been created by European colonists. Have you ever looked at in those deeply, or do you ever look at into it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I edited a book on borders and borderlands in the Horn of Africa. So, of course, I looked into the history of the borders and the colonial borders in the Horn of Africa. So, this is absolutely clear. This is across Africa. I mean, the current state borders in Africa, with one exception, which is South Sudan, have been created in colonial times. And these borders have produced many conflicts in Africa since decolonization, right? I mean, since around 1955, 1960, when most African countries gained their independence, these borders have been a problem. But African leaders have pragmatically settled on accepting those borders. Now, regarding Somalia and Somaliland, of course, the question is so which borders count? So Somaliland had its own colonial borders as a British protectorate. Southern Somalia, which of course also includes Puntland, has its own border as part of the Italian administrative territory. In 1960, both of them decided to unite to form the Somali Republic. Back then, the idea was to have Somaliland, so bigger Somalia, greater Somalia, which also would include parts of Djibouti, eastern Ethiopia, and northern Kenya. So the spirit was one of unification of pan-Somalism, and also the political leaders from Somaliland, I mean, Mohammed Haji Ibrahim Igal and others, were for greater Somalia, right? They were pan-Somalis. There was a strong pan-Somali sentiment also in Hargeisa, in Bro, and other places. Sultan Timur Ade, one of the famous Isaac poets, was strongly anti-colonial and he was strongly pan-Somali. So, I mean, in the 1950s, there was a strong sentiment to unite. So the borders of the British Protectorate and the borders of the Italian administrative territory were merged to form, I mean, these territories were merged, the borders were dissolved to form the Somali Republic. This was the will of Somalis back then from the north and from the south, and this was also supported by the former colonial powers, including Great Britain and Italy and the international community. So actually on 1st of July 1960, the Somali Republic was formed. And in this way, one of the colonial borders between the British Protectorate and the Italian territory was dissolved. So in any case, so this is now still up for discussion. Some people say, no, we have to reestablish this border, but I mean, that's not up
I
to
know.
me
Yeah.
to fight these kind of things. But yeah,
Yeah.
these borders have been a problem. They have been a problem across Africa. But I think Somalis, at least in 1960, agreed that
I,
they overcome it.
yeah, and that the 1961 the Somalis attending the AU African Union Organization.
In 1963.
That was Somaliland was including those who reached that conclusion. But in terms of I know you're not a lawyer and you cannot reach the final decision or opinion in terms of the liability. But still, do you believe when the European colonization is and colonized across the borders all the way the oceans and came the African continent and divided Somalis based on clan. Do you think are they liable to these crimes? The Somalis, they went through, especially they support some of them and they fight against the others.
If you look at the old sources, I mean, old texts like Futuh al-Habasha, for instance, which is from the 17th century, describing the struggle in the Ethiopian highlands, like from Ahmed Gurey against the Ethiopian kings, right? This was 1520s, 1530s. So there's a book called Futuh al-Habasha. I think it was written in the 17th century. And this book already mentions Somali clan names, by the way. It names Bartire, it names Harti, it names some others. So, I mean, Somali clans, I would say, at least according to the historical sources, have not been invented by European colonizers. But Somali clans have
I know
existed.
they're not created, but they divided by clan.
Yes, I mean divide and rule.
Rule and
Divide and rule.
rule.
Divide and rule. This was the strategy of the European colonizers. And absolutely, I mean, this divide and rule politics have been implemented across Africa. It doesn't mean that African actors didn't have any agency, right? I mean, if you look historically in the behavior of Somalis, for instance, when the Ethiopians tried to get some of their land, like in Kilinka Shanat in Region 5, when the British and the Italians and the French and so on tried to get some of their land. I mean, there's an interesting article by a colleague of mine called Kedrick Barnes in a book which I edited on Borders and Borderlands, where he describes how, for instance, the Gadabursi as a clan, with different leaders, with one Ugas and another Ugas, they were actually playing politics between the British and the Ethiopians. You know, some of the Gadabursi joined the protectorate, and some of the Gadabursi took over positions in the Ethiopian empire. So actually. What I'm saying is that yes, divide and rule was the politics of the of the European colonizers, but within these systems, African actors, including Somalis, of course, had a certain amount of agency, trying to position themselves. Yes, and of course, I mean, from to today's perspective, you could say that these divide and rule politics, and also the establishment of boundaries dividing people who actually belong together, that this is one of the main reasons for conflicts in Africa, including in the Horn of Africa. Yes, that you can.
Going back to your report, I have read it, and the question is, how was your report has been received by the international entities so far, and have any measures been taken response to your finding?
Yeah, I have been in contact with members of with some parts of the international community from the beginning of this conflict. So I had conversations with the American embassies in Mogadishu and Djibouti, with the representatives of the European Union in the Horn of Africa, with the World Bank, and with other actors. Even before this most recent report was published, I published some earlier report already on 8th of February, outlining the background of this conflict based on my long-standing research. And now on 8th of June, I published an update, a very long and detailed update on the dynamics of the conflict. So yeah, I think that what I'm writing is being received and read by some members of the international community. So I get some feedback from people, from institutions, who say this was a very helpful report. So yeah, I think it was received. What exact impact it has, it's difficult to say. But I had the impression that, particularly at the beginning of the conflict in February, that my writing, my first report, had a certain impact, that members of the international community took this conflict quite seriously. Mm-hmm. So in contrast to the Kashale the Kashale massacre in 2011, which was not recognized by anyone, nobody really took notice of it. This conflict now is on everybody's screen. So this conflict is now recognized from Washington to Brussels to London to Paris to Nairobi. So everyone has this conflict on their agenda, and they understand that this is a serious issue. And probably I could contribute a little bit to that.
Yeah, thank you for your contribution. Do you accept their impression and interest in the reporting from Lasanod? Do you believe there will be any actions against the proprietaries, including Musabih?
This is very difficult to say. I mean, there have been so many human rights violations in Somalia over the last decades that I'm not sure if there will be any specific steps taken against those responsible for the bombardment of Lasanod and potential war crimes in Lasanod over the past few months. But I think eventually the government of Somaliland will face the consequences, because the international community, many parts of the international community now really realized that Somaliland is not exactly as peaceful and as democratic as its supporters tend to present it, right? I mean, Somaliland was kind of benefiting from this narrative that, in contrast to Somalia, we are peaceful, we are democratic. And now this huge attack against Lasanod, with almost 200,000 people displaced, and according to my calculation, in total around 5,000 casualties, including minimum 1,000 people killed on all sides. And this now shows to the international community that Somaliland is not as peaceful and as democratic as it always presented itself. And I think this will have definitely repercussions for Somaliland. I mean, many international actors are reconsidering their engagement. So I don't know if Musabihi and Mohammed Kahin and others are facing personal consequences, but I think Somaliland as a whole is going to face repercussions from this conflict.
I get that. Are there any personal experience or encounter from your visit that you feel would provide a deeper understanding of the human toll in this conflict has exacted of the people of Lasanod?
Yeah, I mean, what I would remember is, like you have to imagine that throughout this conflict, there were always people in Lasanod through the worst days of shelling, right? I mean, when the Somaliland army, which is well established, well trained, well equipped, they unleashed a considerable military force, right? There were days, particularly in February, but also in March, where they seriously shelled the town for hours, like starting 6 in the morning and until noon, even sometimes until late afternoon. They were shelling, they were bombarding the town. And there were always people in town, always civilians, including women. And what I would remember, for instance, from I spoke with a few women, maybe in their 20s, who were working as nurses in Lasanod. I mean, they were heavily traumatized from these experiences of bombardment, of shelling. I mean, they had to work under conditions where around them mortars were hitting or bullets were flying. Even some nurses were injured by stray bullets. So I remember talking to one or two of these nurses who were young women who until recently were just students in one of these universities of Lasanod. And they now had to experience this death around them. They saw many dead and injured people. They were themselves in danger. They couldn't sleep much anymore. They hardly found any sleep. So I could realize that these young women, maybe 24 years old, they were heavily traumatized from these experiences. So this is one thing I realized what it actually means to live under these kind of circumstances. I also talked with a young fighter who had not been a military person before, and he took up arms to defend his own community. And he also said he was very, very frightened actually when Somaliland started bombarding the town. I mean, it was a horrible experience, and this happened many times. So I think one thing people should realize is that it's not just those people who get injured or died who are suffering from this conflict, but it's also all these IDPs. I saw also IDPs in Calabai. I saw IDPs in Whitwit. I saw the hospitals, which are in the countryside in Calabai, which are supported by Doctors Without Borders, for instance. But still, I mean, the conditions of those people in those hospitals are quite poor, right? The hygiene is there's hardly any hygiene. It's very low level of hygiene. The support with medication is not sufficient always. There's actually thousands of people, including children who are in need of support, nutrition, hygiene. They have no schooling. So I mean, the conflict has lots of impact on the wider community beyond those who are injured or killed, right? I mean, the young women in the hospitals who work there since 4 months under conditions which are traumatizing, the students, the kids who cannot go to school anymore, whose schooling career has been interrupted, and all those injured, all those sick people who are suffering from lack of medical care, particularly in the countryside. I mean, this all is an effect of this conflict.
My question regarding on those towns and the villages you went to, and you met the IDPs. What's the observation that you received from the humanitarian organizations? What was their response on this large-scale humanitarian crisis in this area?
Yeah, as far as I know, there were only a very few organizations continuously working on the ground. So Doctors Without Borders is one of them who were constantly on the ground. I think there was one other organization, but in general, it was due to the conflict. I mean, which was also hindering the transport and and traveling in this area due to this conflict, particularly in February. very few people received any kind of international support, any help. It was impossible for several organizations to access the area, particularly those coming from Hargeisa. They couldn't access the area, either because the road was blocked. I mean, through the conflict, or it was also that, for political reasons they couldn't access the area. So later on, organizations like Doctors Without Borders came from the Puntland side, and they started doing really good work. But in general, the humanitarian crisis didn't receive enough attention by and also enough action by the international community.
Somaliland was claiming, and repeatedly has been claiming since the war started, that they were not handling the humanitarian aids, and that sometimes, in some point, they released it maybe 2 weeks ago, the press release saying that they provided some help. Do you see anything like that in those areas?
No, I didn't see any support coming from Somaliland. I also do not think that the local population would like to receive support from Somaliland, to be very honest.
So the corridor between the Garowe and Lasanod, that you have been using that corridor to go to Lasanod. Tell me about the situation of that road.
Yeah, you can travel along the tarmac road between Garowe and then a place called, it's like Gambare, I think. It's maybe 15 kilometers before you enter Lasanod, or 20. So you can travel a long way from Garowe to Gambare, and then you have to cross the country. You have to go to the countryside. Then you go to the south, and then you travel, through the Hout area and enter Lasanod from the southern side, so from Calabite. And this takes quite a while. So actually, from Garowe to Gambare, it should be something like a good hour, maybe 1 hour 20 minutes. And then when you're going through the countryside, then it takes another 1.5, 2 hours.
Okay, my conclusion on this episode in English language. From your perspective, what steps could you potentially help it to alleviate the war impact and increase the peace in the SSC region?
Yeah, I mean, the first step which needs to be taken is there needs to be a ceasefire, and for this, the Somaliland forces have to withdraw from around Lasanod. This has been discussed now for many months. It's absolutely clear Musa Bihi is just refusing to do that, because if he's giving up Gocha Ade, he's losing, so to say, a very important strategic position. But on the other hand, it's absolutely clear that Dulbahante cannot accept Somaliland army positioned in Gocha Ade. I mean, this is like 5 kilometers out of the town, and from there the town can be shelled anytime, and attacks can be conducted anytime. But actually, the first step for like a lasting settlement is Somaliland withdraws its forces from around Lasanod, and now, given the many victims and the many also human rights violations which happened, conducted by the Somaliland forces in Lasanod and around. So, I mean, I think the Dulbahante are not going to accept any position of Somaliland forces in their lands. So I think the Somaliland army has to withdraw to Oak, which is SAC territory, and vacate the SSC territory. So that's the first step. And then I would imagine that long-term political negotiations could start. And they must, the condition cannot be you have to come back to Somaliland. The condition, these negotiations will happen between, let's say, the government in Hargeisa and the Dulbahante leadership. And as I said earlier, also involving the Puntland government and the government, the federal government in Mogadishu, and ideally some external mediators. Probably Ethiopia could play a role, or other actors could play a role. The discussion should be how to find a lasting political solution for Somalia as a whole, and also respecting what has been achieved in Somaliland, of course. I mean, no question about the achievements. I mean, people in Somaliland, between Hargeisa, Berbera, and Burqa particularly, but also in the western parts, they have rebuilt political order, they have rebuilt stability, they have created economic development. I mean, if you go to Hargeisa today, if you go to Burqa today, you can see those cities are amazingly developed. Also in comparison to how these cities have been like in 2002, 2003, when I saw them first. I mean, Hargeisa became a real capital, Burqa became a real major city in the Horn of Africa. Though this is all, without doubt, this needs to be respected, but at the same time, it needs to be respected that people east of Oak and east of Edigabo, they are not supporting the political project of Somaliland. So there needs to be a peaceful solution for this conflict, and I think it will be a long-term negotiation about the question of Somali unity eventually, and maybe some kind of special status for some territories in central and western Somaliland. I mean, this is not, this must be negotiated, carefully. But so yeah, the first thing which needs to be done is the withdrawal of the Somaliland forces from the SSC territories.
Thank you for your time and this lengthy interview that you have been with us today. I can see your grammar is aad buu fiican waa amazing. khayr baan ku rajeynaya waa ismaqli doona.
Waad mahadsantahay adiga mudan.